United States, autumn 2019. A typical Thursday around late afternoon, on a nearly forgotten rural road, far from big cities and cameras, a 72-year-old woman drove alone in her car, repeating a route she had taken for years. Nothing indicated that this would be the most dangerous day of her life. Minutes later, two cars would appear out of nowhere. A double gang would block the road, and everything that seemed like a common robbery would take a turn that no one expected. In this video, you'll hear a story that never made headlines, never became a statistic, and was never officially explained. A realistic, disturbing story full of details that raise a simple yet profound question. What happens when evil believes it is alone, but it is not? Hello, welcome to this channel of untold stories about Jesus. Stories that don't appear in newspapers, haven't been made into films, and often only survive in the memories of those who lived them. Before we begin, I want to invite you to do something simple but important. Leave a comment below with where you're listening from right now and what the exact time is. I read all the comments. Leave a like so more people can access stories like this. And now, take a deep breath, because what happened on that road, nobody could have imagined. The police report describes the location simply as Highway County Route 17, rural stretch, no streetlights. For those who live in the area, it's known by another name, the road where nobody passes at night. That Thursday afternoon, the sky was clear, but the wind heralded the changing of the season. Dry leaves swirled across the asphalt in small eddies, and the silence was broken only by the distant sound of occasional engines. There were no houses nearby, no shops, just miles of forgotten road. Margaret Lewis, 72 years old, was driving alone. She drove an old sedan, well-maintained but clearly out of step with modern standards. The car had belonged to her late husband, and she had never had the courage to trade it in. For Margaret, that vehicle was not just a means of transportation. It was memory. It was routine. It was security. She had been following the same route for years, every Thursday without exception. First, the cemetery in the small neighboring town. Then, the market. Finally, the return before sunset. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing improvised. Margaret was a woman of rigid habits, shaped by decades of discipline and survival. That afternoon, however, something seemed different. It wasn't fear. It was an uncomfortable feeling, difficult to explain, a slight tightness in her chest, as if the air were heavier. She instinctively slowed down, adjusted the rearview mirror, and continued on. That's when he saw the cars. Two vehicles were parked on the shoulder, a few meters apart. Both were switched off. Both had tinted windows. Nothing indicated a mechanical failure. No warning triangle. No one asking for help. Margaret felt her heart race. She thought about speeding up and driving straight past, but it was too late. As soon as her car approached, the first vehicle started its engine and entered the lane. The second did the same right behind. In a few seconds, she was surrounded. The maneuver was precise, practiced. It didn't seem improvised. The car in front slowed down abruptly. The one behind approached dangerously. Margaret slammed on the brakes, feeling the seatbelt tighten around her chest. The sedan stopped in the middle of the road. She remained motionless for a few seconds, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Silence returned to the room, now thick with tension. The doors opened. 5 men got off the bus. Young people, ordinary clothes, no uniforms, no masks, no hurry. They walked like people who knew exactly what they were doing and where they were. Police would later identify the suspects as members of a dual gang, formed by two groups that acted together in quick robberies in rural areas. The method was always the same: isolated roads, vulnerable victims, short-term action. Margaret opened the door slowly. "Stay there," one of them shouted, his voice firm. She obeyed. When he set foot on the asphalt, his legs trembled. The wind lifted the hem of his coat. One of the men approached and asked for his documents. Another walked around the car, observing the interior. "Are you alone?" one of them asked. Margaret nodded. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't argue. She didn't react. "I had learned throughout my life that some situations require silence. They require surrender." But inside, something resisted. While the men talked amongst themselves, she looked around. There was nowhere to run. No cars were approaching. No houses appeared on the horizon. Only road, dry trees, and open sky. It was at that moment that Margaret closed her eyes. He didn't say a long prayer. He didn't recite verses. He didn't promise anything. She simply thought, "I'm not alone." None of the men heard. None of them noticed. But according to the account she would later give, at that exact moment, something changed. Not in the environment, not in the cars, not in the men. It changed inside her. The feeling of panic gave way to a strange calm, as if someone were there, watching, as if that road so empty wasn't really empty. The men continued talking, laughing and getting closer, and, a few meters behind, in absolute silence, Jesus was watching everything. Margaret's first mistake was believing that because it was daytime, nothing really serious could happen. The second was thinking that those men were nervous. They weren't there. While she stood beside the car, with the door open and her hands visible, the five positioned themselves naturally, as if they had rehearsed it dozens of times. One stood in front, completely blocking the road. Two spread out to the sides, and two others remained close to their cars, watching the horizon. It was a silent siege. "Documents," repeated the man who seemed to be leading the group. Margaret carefully opened her purse. Her fingers took longer than usual to find her wallet. Not because she was disorganized, but because her whole body was trembling, even though she tried to control it. When he handed over the documents, the man leafed through them slowly. He didn't seem interested in the name or the age. He simply confirmed what he already knew from the moment he decided to stop that car. She was alone. 72, another commented, looking over the leader's shoulder. Easy. The word was not spoken in a threatening tone. It was spoken as a statement of fact. Margaret swallowed hard. She felt the wind on her face, carrying the scent of dust and dry leaves. Each second seemed longer than the last. The silence between words was heavy, as if the entire road were holding its breath. One of the men walked all the way around the sedan. He looked at the tires, the trunk, the back seat. He tapped lightly on the window, as if evaluating an item for sale. "Old car, but it must have something in it," he said. Another laughed. "Old people always keep money at home or in their purse." It was at that moment that Margaret tightened her grip on the purse strap. Not because of the money, there was little, but because of what was inside. Old photos, a small rosary worn by time, a folded note her husband had written years before, kept ever since. One of the men noticed the gesture. "Hand over the bag," he ordered. Margaret hesitated for half a second. It wasn't a refusal. It was a human reflex, almost involuntary. The man took a step forward. "Now!" She held out her bag. When he pulled hard, the strap slipped from his hand, and Margaret stumbled slightly forward. Another of the men grabbed her arm, preventing her from falling, but not out of kindness, just to keep her upright. "Calm down, Grandma," he said, with a crooked smile. They opened the bag right there on the hood of the car. The sound of the zipper seemed too loud in the silence of the road. One of them carelessly spread out the contents. Cash counted quickly. Cards, medicine, photos. "Is that all?" one of them complained, holding the pills between his fingers. "What a waste of time!" He threw the pills back into the bag, as if they were trash. Another person picked up the photos. "Who is this?" he asked, showing a picture of a younger man in an old military uniform. "My husband," Margaret replied, almost in a whisper. The man stared at the photo for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then he shrugged and dropped it on the asphalt. The photo was left there, face up. Margaret knelt down. The gesture was automatic, instinctive. She didn't think about whether she should or not. She simply bent down to pick up the photo, carefully, as if that piece of paper were too fragile for the world she was in at that moment. "Hey, get up," said one of the men. She didn't answer. She just picked up the photo, then another, pressing them against her chest. That's where things started to change. There were no sirens, no witnesses appeared. There was no external event to explain the change that was beginning. But one of the men, the youngest, looked away. He didn't like the scene. He couldn't explain why. It wasn't pity. It wasn't fear. It was a deep, almost physical discomfort, as if something was wrong at that specific moment. He took a few steps back. "We've already taken what we had," he said, trying to sound firm. "Let's go." The leader turned his face slowly. Not yet. Margaret remained kneeling. The wind was now blowing stronger. The leaves swirled around her, and according to her later account, it was at that moment that the feeling of calm returned with greater force. She couldn't see anyone but them, but she felt, with absolute conviction, that she was not alone. While the men discussed in hushed voices, the silent presence remained there, observing every decision, every intention, every boundary that was about to be crossed. The road remained empty, and the most dangerous moment was yet to come. Silence returned to the road, but it was no longer the same. Before it seemed empty. Now it was laden with intentions. Margaret remained kneeling on the asphalt, clutching the photographs to her chest. Her thin coat offered no protection from the cold wind that was beginning to descend from the open fields. Her hands trembled, softened, not only from fear, but from the effort of maintaining her dignity in a situation that seemed to be slowly robbing her of it. "Get up," the leader said again, impatiently. She stood up slowly, leaning against the car. Her knees ached. She didn't complain. She didn't look directly at them. She just kept her eyes down, as if that might lessen the tension. But it didn't decrease. One of the men moved too close enough for Margaret to smell the alcohol and smoke clinging to his clothes. He looked her up and down, assessing not only what he could steal, but how far he could go. "You know it could have been worse, right?" he said, in an almost casual tone. Margaret did not respond. She had learned, while still young, that certain phrases don't require a response. They require silent resistance. The man laughed and turned to the others. "Don't even mention it. It's a good thing we're in a good mood today." Laughter echoed between them, short and dry. It wasn't genuine amusement. It was an assertion of power. Another one of them grabbed the bag again and began rummaging through it more aggressively, throwing the objects onto the hood of the car. The sound of something metallic falling caught everyone's attention. The small, old keychain, worn with age, had fallen to the ground. "What the hell is this?" he asked. "From my husband," Margaret replied, her voice faltering. The man kicked the object away, causing it to slide across the asphalt. Margaret stepped forward on instinct. "No," said the leader, raising his hand. "Stay there." She stopped. It was at that moment that the humiliation became clearer. It was no longer about theft. It was about control, about making her understand that on that road they decided everything. One of the younger men watched silently. His eyes darted from Margaret to the leader, then to the ground, then to the empty horizon. He seemed out of place, as if he were physically there but not fully present. "We should go," he repeated, now with more conviction. "Why are you in such a hurry?" another retorted. "Are you feeling sorry for me now?" The word penalty hung in the air. The young man didn't answer. He just clenched his teeth. Margaret noticed. She couldn't explain how, but she did. For the first time since she'd been stopped, she saw cracks in the group, small, almost invisible, but real. Meanwhile, inside her, something remained firm. She felt afraid, very afraid. But strangely, she didn't feel abandoned. It was as if that road, so isolated, was being watched from a point she couldn't see. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to pray in words, but to trust. When it opened again, the men were still there. The situation was still dangerous. But the balance was beginning to shift. "That's enough," the young man said finally. "This has gone too far." The leader turned slowly towards him. "Are you forgetting who's in charge here? The climate has changed. The humiliation had already happened. The money had already been taken. Now all that remained was the decision to leave or to cross a line from which there would be no return." Margaret remained silent, and invisible to them all, the presence that had been observing from the beginning remained there, not imposing force, not interfering physically, but witnessing every choice. The decisive moment was approaching. The wind picked up, kicking up dust and dry leaves that streaked across the road in jagged lines. The sound of branches clanging against each other seemed louder now, as if the environment itself was reacting to the tension building between those men. The gang leader stared coldly at the younger man. It wasn't immediate anger. It was something more dangerous, the need to reaffirm his authority in front of others. "You've been acting strange ever since we stopped the car," he said quietly. "Do you want to explain?" The young man took a deep breath. His gaze wasn't on Margaret at that moment, but it wasn't entirely on the men in front of him either. It was as if he were looking inward, trying to understand why this robbery, so similar to so many others, seemed different. "We've already got the money," he replied. "That's enough." "Not when I say it didn't work," the leader retorted. Two of the other men approached, forming a small circle. Neither of them touched Margaret now. The focus had shifted. For a few moments, she was no longer the victim. Margaret realized this. She remained motionless beside the car, her hands clasped in front of her. Her heart was still pounding, but something inside her remained inexplicably stable. It was as if that fear, despite its intensity, had a limit, as if there were an invisible barrier that prevented it from completely overwhelming her. The young man took a step back. "We agreed it would be quick." Her voice came out firmer than he expected. "We weren't supposed to be messing around with anyone." One of the men laughed nervously. "Look at that. He's become a saint now." The laughter didn't spread to the group. On the contrary, it created more discomfort. The leader approached the young man until they were face to face. "Are you forgetting where you came from?" he asked. "Are you forgetting what we do?" For a moment, the young man almost responded aggressively. His fists clenched, but something held held him back. It wasn't fear of the leader, it was something else. An old, almost forgotten feeling that came from the depths of his memory. The image of his own grandmother appeared in his mind without warning. A simple woman, calloused hands, always insisting that he not get lost. He remembered the tone of her voice. He remembered the smell of the house. He remembered the day he left without saying goodbye. He looked at Margaret again. She stood there, small before them, but not broken. There was something in her posture that didn't match despair. It wasn't defiance, it was dignity. "This is wrong," he said finally. The phrase fell like a dead weight between them. "Wrong!" the leader repeated, incredulous. "Now you've become a judge." Before the argument escalated, one of the other men intervened. "Hey," he said, looking around. "This road is strange today." "Strange how?" another asked. "Too quiet." Everyone was quiet for a second. It was true. No cars had passed for too long. No distant engine sounds. No birds. Only the wind and their own breathing. Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. She couldn't explain it, but she was certain that the silence wasn't empty. The leader realized he was losing control of the situation, not over the victim, but over the group. "We're leaving," he said curtly. Now. No one celebrated. No one smiled. The decision brought no immediate relief, just a heavy feeling of something that almost happened and didn't. The men began to walk away slowly. One of them carelessly tossed Margaret's purse onto the passenger seat. Another pushed the photos closer to the car with his foot. The young man was the last to turn around. Before getting into the car, he looked at Margaret again. Their eyes met for a second. There were no words, just a silent understanding. She nodded slightly, not as a thank you, but as recognition. The engine started almost simultaneously. The sound cut through the silence of the road, breaking that strange suspension in the air. The cars sped off, kicking up dust, and disappeared around the bend ahead. Margaret remained motionless for a few seconds, observing the void they had left behind. Only then did her legs give way, and she leaned against the car to avoid falling. The danger had passed, but the feeling of presence still remained. The noise of the engines gradually faded, swallowed by the curve of the road and the wind that was blowing freely again. For a few seconds, Margaret stood still, unable to move, as if her body hadn't yet understood that the danger had passed. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. Now it seemed full, dense, almost respectful, as if the road had witnessed something that could not be repeated. Margaret placed her hands on the hood of the car and took a deep breath. The air entered her lungs heavily, causing her to cough slightly. Her legs were trembling so much that she had to sit in the driver's seat with the door still open. She looked at her hands. They were dirty with dust, dirty from the asphalt where she had been kneeling minutes before. Minutes. It was hard to believe that all of that had happened in such a short time. She closed her eyes. This time, not out of fear, but because he felt something different. A mixture of profound relief and a strange clarity, as if something had been revealed without words. There was no vision. There was no voice. There was no external sign. But Margaret was absolutely certain of one thing. She was never alone. She vividly remembered the moment the calm arrived, even when the men were still there, even when everything indicated that the situation could worsen. That calm made no logical sense. It wasn't resignation. It wasn't shock. It was a presence. She opened her eyes again and got out of the car. She walked slowly to the spot where the photos had fallen. She knelt down once more, this time without rushing, carefully picking up each one. She wiped the dust off with her coat sleeve. When she held up the photo of her husband, she felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, without knowing exactly who she was thanking. She returned to the car, sat down, closed the door, and remained there for a few more minutes, simply breathing. The clock on the dashboard showed an ordinary, mundane time. Nothing indicated that this day had been different from any other. But for her, nothing would ever be the same again. Margaret started the engine and continued her journey. She didn't accelerate. She didn't change her route. She drove as she always had. But now, every meter traveled seemed laden with meaning. Later, back home, while recounting what had happened on the phone to a close friend, Margaret noticed something curious. As she described the details, her voice didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She spoke firmly. "They left," he said. "They just left." "But why?" asked her friend, still in shock. Margaret took a few seconds to answer, because something stopped them. That night, before going to sleep, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She opened an old Bible kept in the nightstand drawer. She wasn't looking for a specific verse. She just opened it at random and read a few lines. Then he closed the book book and turned off the light. She fell into a deep sleep. Meanwhile, miles away, one of the gang members couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, the image of the elderly woman kneeling repeatedly coming back to his mind. The feeling that he had crossed, or almost crossed, an irreversible boundary kept him awake. He couldn't explain it, but he knew something had changed. The road was still there. The robbery didn't make it into any statistics. No headlines were published. But on that day, on a forgotten road in the United States, a decision was made, and someone watched everything. In the days that followed, nothing seemed different at first glance. Margaret woke up early, made coffee, watered the plants in her small garden, and followed her routine with the same precision as always. To anyone observing her from the outside, that Thursday on the road had left no visible marks, but it had left deep scars. She began to avoid that stretch of road, opting for a longer route to reach the neighboring town. Not out of fear, she herself made a point of making that clear, but out of respect. Something in that place had ended. Something had been decided there, and she felt no need to return. When she finally decided to report the incident to the local police station, the officer who attended to her listened in silence, making brief notes. There was no major investigation. Without license plate numbers, without cameras, without witnesses, the case became part of a long list of unsolved incidents. The lady was lucky, the police officer said at the end. Margaret did not respond immediately. It wasn't luck, he corrected gently. It was something else. The police officer looked up, confused. She simply thanked him and left. That same week, in a city far away, a young man walked into a community center asking for help. He said he wanted to quit what he had been doing. He didn't mention names. He didn't mention specific crimes. He just said he needed to get out before it was too late. The advisor who assisted him would remember that conversation years later. He looked like someone who had seen something he couldn't forget, she would say. The young man started working temporary jobs. He changed his number. He avoided old contacts. Whenever someone mentioned isolated roads or easy jobs, he would fall silent. At night, before going to sleep, the image would return. An elderly woman kneeling on the asphalt, holding photos as if she were holding on to her own life. And along with that image, a strange feeling of being watched, not with judgment, but with expectation. Meanwhile, Margaret began doing something new. Every morning before leaving the house, she would stop for a few seconds at the door, take a deep breath, and say in a low voice, "I know I'm not alone." She didn't tell anyone about that part. For her, there was no need to explain. What happened on that road didn't need to be proven. It only needed to be experienced. The world went on its course. Gangs continued to exist. The roads remained dangerous. But for some people, something had changed irreversibly, and that was enough. The case never received an official number that anyone would remember. In the police station's files, it was recorded only as rural road stop, no injuries. No line mentioned the time Margaret spent kneeling on the asphalt. No note spoke of the strange silence that formed between those men. No word explained why a gang accustomed to violence simply left. Reports don't record awareness, nor internal decisions, nor the exact moment when someone chooses not to cross a line. Margaret continued living. Months later, he drove down that road again, not out of necessity, but by choice. He wanted to know if the fear was still there. He wanted to understand if what he had felt was real or just a reaction to the danger. She pulled the car over to the side of the road for a few minutes. The place seemed ordinary. The same trees, the same worn asphalt, the same wind crossing the field. Nothing indicated that anything important had happened there. Still, Margaret closed her eyes, and once again she felt the same calm. She didn't tell anyone about that part. Some experiences don't need witnesses. They need silence. On the other side of the country, the young man who had left the gang built a discreet life. He never became a public figure. He never gave interviews. He never told the whole story. But at specific moments, when he saw someone vulnerable on the street, when he heard news of gratuitous violence, he remembered the road and the feeling of being observed not as a criminal, but as someone who could still choose. He never knew the woman's name. Margaret never knew his name. They never saw each other again. And perhaps that was part of the meaning of it all. Some encounters aren't meant to continue. They exist only to prevent something worse from happening. Years later, already in frail health, Margaret told the story to a granddaughter. She didn't go into details. She didn't describe faces. She didn't speak of fear. I simply said, there was a time when bad people could have done something terrible, and they didn't. didn't. Why? Asked the granddaughter. Margaret smiled with the serenity of someone who no longer needs to prove anything. Because someone was watching. On that forgotten road in the United States, there were no visible miracles, no instant transformation, no spectacular punishment. There were only choices. And sometimes this is how evil is contained, not by force, but by presence. They never knew, they never fully understood, but on that day, while a double gang surrounded the car of a defenseless elderly woman, Jesus was watching everything. Time has a peculiar way of erasing details, but preserving sensations. Years after what happened on that rural road in the United States, almost no one would remember the exact day, the precise time, or the weather conditions. But for those who were there, directly or indirectly, something remained intact. Margaret was never the same woman again, and that didn't mean weakness. It meant depth. Before that day, she lived cautiously, but also with a certain rigidity. The years had taught her discipline, repetition, control. After the road trip, something softened. She began to listen more, to observe more, to perceive nuances that had previously gone unnoticed. She understood, with a clarity that didn't come from logic, that evil doesn't always present itself as monsters or grand tragedies. Sometimes it arises in ordinary situations, in forgotten places, betting that no one is watching, but someone is always there. Margaret never said she saw Jesus. She never claimed to have heard a voice. She never described anything that could be easily discredited. She simply said, "I felt it," and that was enough. Over the years, she began to tell the story only when she felt someone needed to hear it, not as a warning, not as an explicit religious testimony, but as a reminder that choices exist, even in the worst moments. Some people listened and were moved, others listened and remained silent. Some simply changed the subject, but there was always a curious detail. No one laughed. No one immediately disbelieved her, because there was something in the way she told her stories that prevented trivialization. There was no exaggeration. There was no heroism, just facts and silence. Meanwhile, on the other side of the story, the young man who had distanced himself from the gang continued to live his life discreetly. He never became a public example. He never became a success story. He never told his story in churches or interviews, but he never participated in another robbery. He never surrounded anyone again. He never put himself in that position again. He carried with him a constant sense of being watched, not out of fear, but out of awareness, as if every choice was observed not for punishment, but for evaluation. He learned something that day that no sermon had ever been able to teach. Limits are not imposed from the outside. They are born from within. Often, when driving along long, empty roads, he would slow down, not out of fear of ambushes, but because those landscapes reminded him of who he almost became and who he decided not to be. He never knew Margaret's name. He never heard her voice again. He never received explicit forgiveness, but he also never forgot her eyes. Eyes that didn't ask for pity. They didn't beg. They simply existed. As time passed, Margaret grew even older. Her steps slowed. Her memory began to fail her on small details, names, dates, appointments. But that day was never forgotten. In her later years, she enjoyed sitting on the porch in the late afternoon and watching the sky change color. Sometimes someone would ask if she was afraid of living alone. She was smiling. "After a certain amount of experience, loneliness ceases to exist," he would reply. She wasn't explaining anymore. It wasn't necessary. The world continued exactly as it always had. Gangs continued to exist. Roads remained dangerous. Vulnerable people continued to be targeted by those who believe that might makes right. But silently, stories like that one are repeated every day. Unrecorded, not filmed, not going viral. Moments when someone decides not to cross a line. Moments when evil retreats without understanding why. Moments when nothing happens, and precisely for that reason, everything matters. Perhaps this is humanity's greatest misconception, believing that the absence of tragedy means the absence of divine intervention, when often it is exactly the opposite. What didn't happen on that road was just as important as what could have happened. There were no deaths. There was no extreme violence. There were no headlines. There was restraint, and restraint requires presence. In those untold stories, Jesus doesn't always appear as a spectacular savior. Sometimes he appears as an invisible limit, as an awakened conscience, as an inexplicable calm in the heart of someone who should be gripped by panic. That double gang never knew. They they would never fully understand, and perhaps they never needed to, because some interventions don't exist to be explained. They exist to be felt. If you've made it this far, it's probably no coincidence. Perhaps you are hearing this story at a specific moment in your life. Perhaps you are facing a choice. Perhaps you are walking down a lonely road, literally or symbolically. And perhaps the message isn't fear, but remembrance. A reminder that you are never as alone as you think. A reminder that every decision matters. A reminder that good often works in silence. Margaret passed away years later, peacefully, surrounded by few, but with a full heart. The young man continued living, carrying an invisible scar that paradoxically saved him, and the road is still there, common, forgotten, silent. But if you ever travel down that road, or any other similar road in life, you might remember this story, and perhaps you'll understand that, even when no one seems to be watching, Jesus sees everything.